Thank you for spending this time to think with me about Presbyterian mission, past and present. So, a lot of churches are thinking about mission in the future. And when we do that, I would invite you to think about the past as well. But we might ask ourselves, why think about the past? Why even learn about the past when what we're trying to do is to chart a course into the future of God's mission? We need to understand where we've been in order to better understand where mission is now. And I think we know that typically it's important to learn from our mistakes. We can look back and see how mission has been carried out well, where we've committed mistakes, and what we can learn from both the gifts and the ways in which mission has been done well, and also how it's not been done well. I also think that it's important to look at who is telling the story or the stories of mission. What is missing and what are maybe the gaps in the story, the silences? That is something to think very carefully about. Any story that I tell you today will be through my own lenses and my own understanding. You might hear the same story or the same timeline of history, but from a very different perspective from somebody who comes from a different place, of a different age, a different gender or race, ethnicity, and with different life experience. So listen to the history, but ask questions of it and look for those silences as well. Now, in the 1700s, the Presbyterian Church was formed, and by 1790, presbyteries began sending missionaries. The international sending of missionaries by the Presbyterian Church in the early 1800s was through the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission. It was an interdenominational body that was sending missionaries cooperatively. There were overtures starting in the 1812, and you can see on the slide all the way through into the 1830s for the Presbyterian Church to have its own Presbyterian Mission Board. And this occurred in 1838, basically at the same time as there was a split in the church of the old school and the new school. There were a lot of reasons why there was a split in the church at that time, and it later healed a few decades in the future after this split. But in regard to mission, the old school split and with the new school had to do with how mission should be carried out, or whose call you were following, whose direction. The old school thought that mission should be controlled by the church, by an ecclesial body. So they were the leaders behind the creation and the leadership of this Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission. The new school felt that mission, if you felt a call to mission, you should just be able to go and serve in mission without necessarily having any oversight from the board of the church. So in the Civil War establishes the southern and northern branches. Now, if we go back a little bit, a few decades before, I think it's notable to learn that by 1830, women were already half of all missionaries, and by 1900, it was 2/3 of all missionaries were women. Also notable with the Civil War, even though the church had northern and southern branches and the mission sending was happening through two different boards, two different branches, there were a lot of instances in which Presbyterian mission was carried out together by the different branches of the Presbyterian Church. Presbyterian women were, from the very beginning of Presbyterian mission, not only people serving as missionaries, but also supporting missionary efforts. They were one of several different volunteer missionary movements which had the goal of the evangelization of the world in this generation. And what that meant was the proclamation of the gospel to all people. So this was sort of the feeling and the fervor of mission in the end of the 1800s and into the beginning of the 1900s. The missionary education movement was born in the early 1900s. There were a lot of conferences happening around this time. The student volunteer movement, which decades later was a precursor to the Urbana student conferences decades later, were also kind of born in this fervor of proclamation of the gospel, of evangelization. The New Wilmington Missionary Conference, which is now called the New Wilmington Mission Conference, was one of those conferences born during this time, and it still exists. It's the longest standing Presbyterian mission conference in our denomination, and it brings together Presbyterians of different theologies and different ways of thinking about mission in Western Pennsylvania every year. So when we look at mission, I'll bring you back to those words I said at the beginning. It's not a single story. There are different ways of looking at how mission occurred and different threads to that story. So it's true that many times missionaries colluded with colonial interests, or even sometimes held positions as missionaries while they were also working for the U.S. government. Other times, missionaries fought against U.S. government interests when these were harmful for the communities in which they were serving. A critical question about the stories that we hear around mission then is also, how often are we hearing the stories about mission from the people where the missionaries lived? Not from the missionaries, but from the communities that were receiving the missionaries, that were being served by perhaps the missionaries or working alongside them. So this is very important for us to think about. At the same time, it's important to look at the questions of these different stories we hear as they align with history. Mission history is tied with political history and comes alongside economic history. So those are the sorts of lenses we can bring to the stories that we hear. So I'm just going to share a couple of examples of mission from the late 1800s and into the early 1900s to give you a sense of the variety of the kinds of service that was going on, and even some models that to me feel like, at least at the surface level, they don't feel colonial. They seemed kind of a cutting edge in some ways. And one example we can look at is this plan that was called the NEVIUS plan, and was built around these three ideas of that when a missionary were to go into a community or to a country, that the church there would be would grow and be supported and governed by the people of that place, and not controlled and led and propagated by the missionaries or by people from outside of that country or of that place. So this idea of the three self-principles, self-support, self-government, and self-propagation, the thought was that they started in Korea. They were actually quite influential also in China. John Livingston Nevius was a missionary serving in China and who was going through Korea on his way to the United States for a time of rest and furlough. And his ideas, he presented his ideas in Korea in the late 1880s, and they really caught on there and had a huge impact on Presbyterian mission in Korea. It was actually approved later as a mission policy of the Board of Foreign Missions a few decades later at Princeton. Couple of noteworthy things, though, is that it might not be very fair to call the NEVIUS plan the NEVIUS plan, because there's evidence that other missionaries from decades prior had similar ideas or were leading with these same principles. And there's also evidence that the church in China, that there were Chinese leaders as well who might have been developing these ideas around the same time. And in fact, these three self-principles did come to be followed in China and became kind of essential tenets of the Christian church there. Another story that we are learning more and more about as Presbyterians during the past few years is about Native American boarding schools. which were very common starting in like the 1880s through the end of the 1920s. And I'm sure that we've heard stories about some of the tragedy that and the harm that was done through Native American boarding schools in North America. With westward expansion of white settlers in the United States in the 1880s, boarding schools for Native Americans were seen by the United States government and by a lot of church denominations as a way to try to integrate or try to make Native peoples assimilate to a white Christian way of life. So these schools, at the beginning, a lot of them were day schools, and then it became apparent that these goals of trying to make people, the different peoples of many different Native populations and nations, to become assimilated, to learn English, to learn values such as capitalism and individualism and the Christian religion, they needed to be living there at more full time in order for that to happen. So boarding schools where kids were sometimes forcibly taken from their families, brought into the boarding school, and sometimes wouldn't see their families for years, and lost their culture, lost their language, was not uncommon. White missionaries, there are stories that some of these missionaries didn't see any other way out. I mean, they saw the government moving and bringing populations of our relatively new United States of America further and further west. And so I think in some cases, white missionaries were concerned with poor treatment and perhaps had good intentions of trying to help. But the help that was happening was often doing harm. There was a lot of abuse, forced labor, or ill treatment in these schools. And of course, like in any boarding school that we can imagine, there was also illness sometimes. And so when there was the flu pandemic of 100 years ago, that killed a lot of kids and youth. And some decades before that, there were outbreaks of tuberculosis and things like that. So what I want to point out about this is, even though it's possible that some missionaries didn't have ill intentions, harm was done through Native American boarding schools. Children and youth lost their way, lost their culture and their family connections. There is a lot more to learn about this if you go to the pcusa.org website and look up some of the resources there, including resources about manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery. You can learn more about the contexts of these boarding schools. I would also recommend to you a book called Education for Extinction by David Wallace Adams, and that gives a very comprehensive history of the boarding schools in North America. Some of you may have heard of William Shepherd, who did advocacy work in the Congo at the turn of the century, so in the early 1900s and in the late 1800s. Now, William Shepherd, one thing that I find to be most interesting, and what a lot of times those of us who know about him think about, is that mission may not always seem to be about that fervor of proclamation or evangelization that I talked about earlier. So his work was around advocacy. William Shepherd was a graduate of Stillman College, and he was pastoring a church in Atlanta and had gone to the mission board of the Southern Church, the PCUS, many times to be sent to the Congo as a missionary. He was rejected kind of offhandedly more than once. And finally, he went to apply in person for service. The General Assembly of the Southern Church agreed, but they decided that without a white missionary to accompany him, Shepherd could not go. So another seminary graduate, Samuel Lapsley, agreed to go, and the two of them sailed to Congo in February 1890. 2 years later, Lapsey died of a fever. Shepherd came back about a year after that for furlough in the United States and married Lucy Gant. And the two of them went back to Congo then to serve for 2 decades. Shepherd, together with another missionary, William Morrison, I believe, were advocating in the 1900s, in the very beginning of that century, for the Congolese people who were being exploited by King Leopold of Belgium. The king was using Congo as his private, farm, extracting rubber and ivory through concessionary companies. And both Shepherd and Morrison took up this cause. They went to the government in Belgium and also the U.S. And a rubber contractor brought libel suits against both of them, both Shepherd and Morrison. In 1909, they stood trial. A lot of Congolese friends came as witnesses. And this started a movement of reform. King Leopold eventually relinquished his personal control of the nation. It did become a Belgian colony. And what I think is less known about this story, and that I've learned more recently, is that Dr. William Shepherd, suffered a lot of abuses in his own way. He was the one putting himself forward as taking photographs of Congolese who'd been punished, who had hands cut off and things like that. And if you look closer at the history, you can see the racist treatment in Dr. Shepherd, in the way in which he was perhaps put at greater risk at times in those in the investigation and the witnessing and advocacy efforts that he was engaged in. And after the suit had been resolved, and William Shepherd and William Morrison were absolved. I mean, they weren't charged with any crimes, but this ended Dr. Shepherd's career. And there's a lot more to the story, but what ended up happening was he was sent back. I mean, he wasn't really permitted to continue serving as a missionary. So his whole career as an advocate, as a missionary, an international leader ended, and he was sent back to the United States. And in fact, he started a church in Louisville, Kentucky. It's about a mile from where I live, and had leadership and impact there. But from what I understand, it was quite a disappointment that he could not return to the Congo. And Lucy Gant Shepherd also made her mark. She began the first school in the Presbyterian Congo mission, and she was also instrumental in having a hymnal printed in the Shaluba language. So, 1910, the World Missionary Conference was held in Edinburgh in Scotland, where 1,200 delegates were present, representing 176 missionary societies. Catholics and Orthodox churches were not invited, and the delegation was based on how much money was sent abroad for international mission. So there were only a few Asian delegates representing the non-Western world. There were no Africans, no Latin Americans, and no delegates from the South Pacific. So essentially, the conference was built around the participation of missionary societies, but not the churches that were considered the fruits of missionary work. And there are a couple of notable people who spoke at this conference that I think shaped the discourse of the conference and also impacted mission in years and even decades to come. One was the Chinese delegate, Cheng Cheng-yi, and during a discussion on a report that he'd made about inter-Christian cooperation in education and evangelization, he spoke about this idea of establishing in the near future a united interdenominational Christian church. And because of his words, his speech, many look at this conference in Edinburgh as the basis of the ecumenical movement. The World Missionary Conference organized several other international conferences in the decades to follow. So in Jerusalem, there was a conference in the 1920s, India in the 30s, Canada in the 40s, and then so on and so on. And by 1961, the conference became part of the World Commission for mission and evangelization, organized by the World Council of Churches. So the conference became absorbed or became part of the World Council of Churches many decades later. And by that time, there were delegates from churches from around the world, and also various Orthodox churches were included. Another person who spoke at the conference that had a very notable speech at the very end of the conference on an evening in June in 1910 is this Anglican priest who was known as V.S. Azariah. And the words that he said at the end of the conference are notable because I think they could be spoken today and ring very true and very pertinent to our intention to work and mission in partnership. And this is what he said: "We ought to be willing to learn from one another and to help one another. Through all the ages to come, the Indian Church will rise up in gratitude to attest to the heroism and self-denying labors of the missionary body. You have given your goods to feed the poor. You have given your bodies to be burned. We also ask for love. Give us friends." These words were spoken over 100 years ago. And I think the intention behind them, the desire to work in mission and partnership, is just as critical now. And it's still a really hard thing for us to be able to accomplish truly well. So this conference is seen as sort of igniting or being a starting point for a time of ecumenism. Following the First World War and before the Second World War, the mission education movement that I mentioned, that was kind of end of the 1880s, beginning in the 1900s, was transformed into a concept in the 1920s of what was being called world friendship. So the mission education movement was a way by which mainline denominations were teaching their membership about mission. And some denominations were using these words of world friendship in the 20s and 30s to describe what mission was about. There was a huge push for internationalism, and kind of that zeal around the idea of the proclamation of the gospel just in word. It was still there through one stream that was more evangelical, but there was also another stream that was beginning to look at more programmatic and actions around peace and justice and gathering ecumenically as another expression of mission. So you can see here the world friendship kind of movement, ecumenical councils being born, like the National Council of Churches, Church World Service, and the World Council of Churches. And One Great Hour of Sharing was born in the years just following World War II. The 1950s marks a very interesting time in the Presbyterian Church. In the late 50s, there was a consultation held in New York State called the Lake Mohonk Consultation, and this was held at the very eve of the union of what at the time were two northern branches of our denomination. So we had the separation between North and South, but also in the North there was a very small United Presbyterian Church in North America, a body that had been born in 1858, and then the Presbyterian Church in the USA, which was the larger northern branch. They joined together in the late 50s, and on the eve of that joining together, they held this conference. Now, they'd already been talking for several years about the nature of international mission and the intention and the desire to decolonize mission. So one of the goals of the consultation was what was called the full integration of missions into national churches within 5 years. And what this meant was, at that time, the most common expression of Presbyterian mission was that, say, like the Iraq mission or Mexico mission was an actual like compound of missionaries living together, and they were directed and guided by a supervisor who was a missionary. And so what this meant was to integrate the missions into national churches was to let go of properties, schools, hospitals, these mission stations to the hands of the churches that had been born during the years that Presbyterian mission had come to help establish them alongside the people in these places where they'd been serving. So instead of having people from the US controlling these properties and these projects, hospitals, schools, they were handing them over to what we would consider now our global partners. And the mission workers, the missionaries, they changed the name to fraternal worker, and they were working as colleagues. They were working under the direction not only of a supervisor based in the US, but also under the direction of the global partner as colleagues and supervisors. So it was a huge shift. It didn't happen overnight, and there were a lot of bumps and maybe bruises along the way. And just one example, you can imagine if there was a Presbyterian mission in a given country where there had not been a lot of work to strengthen the leadership of the partner church there, or if it wasn't a very big church yet, to suddenly give them all of the control and authority and all the property all at once, if that wasn't done with care and with a true kind of mission and partnership approach and accompaniment approach to help strengthen the leadership there and help the partners be ready to receive all of what it would mean to have these responsibilities and this property. In some cases, that didn't work so well. And in some cases, the way in which that was done maybe caused some harm. So those are all different stories that can be looked at. Another interesting piece of this is this advisory study that was born out of the Lake Mohawk consultation and the establishment of a mission body. So the merger and what was once the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission between these two northern denominations, together with different committees on mission and ecumenism, came together to form the Commission on Ecumenical Mission and Relations. So that was a new body that was formed, and they had this advisory study. It was carried out mostly by global partners and some missionaries to kind of explore how God was calling the church globally in mission. And so you can look at some of the highlights here. This study that was done, which was meant to be a report, was not brief. It was about 100 pages. You can access it through our Presbyterian Historical Society. And it really looked at some questions about the purpose of the church in a witnessing community and what the growing edges of the church are and how to employ or to use missionaries and money, how churches can become indigenized, and this call for churches to move away from dependence to independence and even interdependence between them. So this is a study, and it looks at history, but it looks at the theology of mission as well. So this whole movement of the Commission on Ecumenical Mission and Relations, the advisory study into the 1960s, was a time for churches that had been missions of the Presbyterian Church to move away from this idea of the mother church and to be independent. There was a moratorium in many countries on having missionaries at all. So the countries that I know of included Mexico, Brazil, Iran, the Philippines, and many others. So there was a period of time when these countries were saying, please don't send us missionaries right now. You know, we are fine without you, and we want to be the church without you coming alongside us right now. So that was a movement during the time of the 1960s. Into the 70s, that new mission structure, the Commission on Ecumenical Mission and Relations, or COMAR, broke up. There was a furlough of tons of staff and a restructuring, and what was now the United Presbyterian Church in the USA, the Northern Church, was focused on programmatic concerns. And so there was less of this emphasis on this direct evangelism or proclamation, and again, a strengthening and a focus of social justice issues. Self-development of people was born then. The Presbyterian hunger program, mission responsibility through investment came in the 1970s, and peacemaking was born in 1980. Presbyterian disaster assistance, incidentally, actually was born shortly after World War II and had many different names through those decades. So it has a bit of an older history. So if we go backward just a little bit and look at just mission models. So something that is very interesting to note is that the number of missionaries from independent and evangelical missions surpasses the sending of missionaries from mainline denominations and bodies by 1968. So that is just an interesting trend that happens. And at the same time, there are, during those times in the 60s all the way through the 90s, many different new models for service are emerging. The frontier mission interns were people serving from all around the world in different communities around the world and looking at frontiers. But the frontiers were things like urbanization, nationalism, women's issues, racism. And so those were the things that they were looking at. I find that to be a very interesting model, and it was largely led by the Presbyterian Church, the northern branch, during the 1960s, even though it was an ecumenical effort. And it was very similar in nature to a kind of a Peace Corps model. Mission to the USA became a program in the 60s or 70s officially, but what it meant was it was bringing global partners to come to the United States for a period of time to serve in mission to our churches and our communities here in the United States. And in fact, we as a denomination had been bringing and inviting global missionaries to come and speak in our churches and be present to us since at least the 1930s. So where the program became official in later decades and existed kind of officially as a Presbyterian Church USA program into the 2000s or so, it began, at least by the 1930s. Reconciliation and Mission was another interesting program that brought together people from the United States with people from countries in Central America to live in community together for a few weeks and then serve in each other's contexts in ministry. That's actually how I got involved in mission in the first place in the 1990s. I participated in that program, and I met my husband, Elmer, who's from Honduras, in the Reconciliation and Mission program as he participated, ended up serving in Albuquerque, New Mexico, while I was in Honduras serving. So you can see all these different models and changes. I mentioned the name of missionary moving to fraternal worker in the late 50s. There have been other names like diaconal worker, and the more recent nomenclature for missionary that we use as a denomination is mission co-worker. So we serve as colleagues at the invitation of our global partners, rather than just going someplace that we, as the U.S. Peace USA, thinks we need to go. We go at the invitation of our partners. We serve as co-workers. In the early 80s, we see the reunion of the Southern and Northern churches to form the Peace USA, and there's a whole reorganization of mission priorities. Those two branches of the church formally and finally come together in 1988 in Louisville. And I'm still trying to learn about what was going on in those years. But what I can tell you is, and what I have learned, is that there was a enormous gap in sort of working culture, perhaps mission culture, between the northern and southern branches. So I'm imagining it was very hard to bring those two bodies together to figure out priorities and to serve together, at least initially. Globalization becomes a reality starting in the 80s, the 90s. It becomes much easier to travel. Short-term mission becomes a phenomenon, and basically, whether for the shorter term and later for longer term, a lot of congregations in the U.S., at least the larger ones or middle to larger sized churches, kind of begin to see themselves with the potential to send missionaries. Again, whether it's a short-term trip or a longer-term placement, there isn't as much dependence during this time on the denomination to be the body through which mission sending occurs. And I think that while there's a lot of gifts in each congregation being able to participate as they feel called, I also think there are a lot of gifts that our denomination can bring to the table for the preparation and training of mission workers and for the support of mission co-workers. And so that's a very interesting trend to be mindful of and to think about. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, a lot of mission networks began to be formed, and the intention behind this was that churches that had partnerships or presbyteries that had partnerships could join together with other churches or presbyteries that had partnerships in the same place, maybe with the same partners, say with the Presbyterian Church of Ghana or with the Council of Protestant Churches in Nicaragua. And so you could gather together as a network of churches in the U.S. that were all serving in the same location so that you could learn from each other and maybe coordinate your efforts, learn from each other's mistakes, and be more of a unified Presbyterian body in your relationships and connections with those partners. And those have developed and changed a lot over the years. If you want more information about mission networks, feel free to reach out to me. The early 2000s, a General Assembly policy was adopted into 2003. And this policy is a rich statement. I commend it to you as a policy for study. There are a number of principles in it, great questions for reflection. It really looks at a theology of mission. How do we intend to be in mission? We can look back at that, the words of V.Z. Azariah at the World Missionary Conference in 1910, and this desire for friendship, this desire for partnership. So what does that look like? How do we do that as Presbyterians? This policy gets into those questions. And it helps us think about, discerning and deep questions, for example, that no partner would dominate another because of their affluence or their expertise, and really looking at mutual giving and receiving, self-determination, and things like that. So that was an official policy adopted, but I would say it's still something that's difficult to live into fully, because when we engage in mission, we're doing so across cultures. Pretty much wherever we go, whether it's in the United States or across the world, we're engaging in different cultures when we do that. And so there's a lot we need to continue to learn about how we're engaging in mission if we want to do mission in partnership well, if we want to do mission and do it without causing any harm. The focus of mission was kind of captured in this statement from the early 2000s called Gathering for God's Future. So some of the themes you'll see there are witnessing, evangelizing, equipping the church for what is called transformational service, and engaging in ministries of reconciliation, justice, healing, and grace. And I think you'll see from these mission priorities and this kind of strategic document or vision document of our denomination, a lot of similar themes and ideas carrying forward even until now. So following that, World Mission and then later the Presbyterian Mission Agency took up the work of critical global initiatives, looking at addressing the causes of poverty, ending violence, and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ in varied ways, both through word, through proclamation, but also through deed. So you can see how this Gathering for God's Future and these critical global initiatives kind of connect with each other. They weave together. And then we also know now that we've got the Matthew 25 vision that has been born of a General Assembly mandate from a few years ago, and that the three foci in this Matthew 25 vision is dismantling structural racism, ending systemic poverty, and building congregational vitality. There's a lot more that you can learn about this if you go to pcusa.org Matthew 25. There you can find the vision of this initiative and this work, and Bible studies, videos, and many other resources to better understand what this work can look like. And now the Presbyterian Mission Agency is in a new season of revisioning and restructuring so that we can be continue to try to be relevant to presbyteries and synods and to congregations across the church. So if you just take a deep breath, and I just want to bring forward to you these trends and sort of core topics that have come up through this talk on history. Here are some of the things and the questions we can look at throughout history. Who directs and sends? Who is the sending body in mission? How is it organized? How is it funded? And who controls the funding? What are the different models of service? And how can we look back and see what has worked well, what's been exciting and cutting edge that we've let go of? Like that reconciliation and mission program in which my husband and I met, it no longer exists. Why? And so I just would hope that we can look at these themes, including the focus, look back at trends, how things have ebbed and flowed over the years, to better understand who we are now as a denomination in mission, and also what it means for each mid-council and for each congregation. So you might take a look at this history and put it alongside the history of mission of your congregation and see how things fit and see why something that was happening nationally or globally maybe had an impact on the way your church was engaging in God's mission. So as we end, I encourage you to consider these questions. Maybe there's time in the place where you are sitting now by yourself or in a group to think about what stood out to you. What did you not know? What was new information for you? Or what was insightful? Maybe it was something you knew about, but you didn't know as much as you know now. What questions does it raise for you? And again, how do you see your congregation's mission history fitting in? So finally, I just want to thank you for this time to share. There is so much more to learn about mission and mission history in the Presbyterian Church. Like I mentioned earlier, the Presbyterian Historical Society is a great resource. And if there's any way that that World Mission or the Presbyterian Mission Agency can be of service to your congregation, to your presbytery, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.